Go. Hi, Jacob.
Hi, Henry.
How are you doing?
Excellent.
So, I guess we have to engage in combat as members of the, centre-left and centre-right on a variety of foreign policy issues today. This is a all-foreign policy blogging heads. But disappointingly, I think we wanted to do something on Obama in Berlin, and I read a national interest piece that you had on the website, and I couldn't see very much to disagree with. It was pretty well everything that I would have said myself in response to Joseph Joffe. So maybe if you can just lead in by just talking a little bit about what you said there, and maybe we can move on to Obama's visit to Germany more generally.
Well, I tried to make two fundamental points. The first point is that Barack Obama has seized the initiative on foreign policy from Senator John McCain. The result is that McCain, in my view, is now showing signs of desperation by lashing out in television ads accusing Obama of having failed to visit the wounded troops in Kaiserstuhl in Germany. And to me, it reeks of panic in the McCain campaign. Second point that I made was that I believe that skeptics of Obama, such as Joseph Joffe, who wrote an online piece in the New Republic, got it completely wrong when he argued that Europeans would soon be disillusioned with Barack Obama. Quite the contrary. I think that, in fact, contrary to Joffe's argument, who maintained that Europe is a 99-pound weakling in comparison to the United States, that it's the United States that is now floundering and has become what I call an international mendicant that is seeking aid from the Europeans. And the ultimate question I have for you, Henry, though, as a true Euro weenie, which I am not, is how far do we go? Would you like to see Senator Barack Obama, who now calls himself a world citizen, advocate that the United States give up the dollar and become a member of the European Union?
Probably not. This is kind of pushing it a little bit. But let me just say before you get onto the world citizen stuff that not only Barack Obama but John F. Kennedy and I believe Ronald Reagan used pretty similar language in some of their more stirring speeches, as Josh Marshall and Matt Iglesias have pointed out. So as to the U.S. becoming a Euro, I think this would be a bad thing, both for the European Union and for the United States. But I do think that what we are seeing is a little bit of a convergence of agreement of values over the last several years, which I think could really come to fruition under an Obama presidency. That is that that certainly there are going to be existing tensions. There's always going to be tensions in international relations. But if we were in a situation where the U.S. recognized that military power didn't solve everything, and also stopped engaging in some of the creepy practices involving torture, extraordinary rendition, and whatever, I think a lot of the major problems in the EU-US relationship would be resolved as a result, and we would see the beginning of a coming together on shared collective values, which we haven't seen very much of over the last several years.
But what about Afghanistan, Henry? Everyone's saying, or the critics are saying, that European-American relations, particularly with Germany, are bound to be stressed by the fact that Barack Obama is intent on expanding the conflict in Afghanistan to remedy what he sees as the Bush administration's failure to prosecute the war against al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. Are we going to demand that the Germans send troops into southern Afghanistan? How will that influence relations with Europe? Why will everything be hunky-dory?
No, as I say, I didn't think that things would be hunky-dory, and I do think that this is going to be something which is going to put some real pressures on the Europeans, because in a certain sense they have been able to take the back seat on a bunch of these issues exactly because the George W. Bush administration has been so extraordinarily obnoxiously awful and incompetent at the same time. And I think a pretty good example of an analogy from within the European Union itself is the way that the Brits dealt with various issues in the European Union actually was kind of convenient for a bunch of members of the EU for a very long time under the Thatcher era. In other words, if Germany or France didn't like a piece of legislation that seemed vaguely pro-European, pro-social market, this, that and the other, the Germans or the French didn't have to take the lead on it because they could rely upon the UK to veto the thing, and so therefore they basically didn't have to, so they didn't have to expend any political capital. They could just shake their heads gravely about how awful the UK had been. And this changed when Tony Blair came into office and was, at least to some extent, a more pro-Europe person than his predecessors had been. And I think we may be seeing a situation like that with the European Union, that a lot of European states have been able to shake their heads gravely at George W. Bush and have been able to avoid a lot of very unpleasant problems as a result of doing that. And I think that it is going to put pressure on the Europeans. But the question is whether this...
Well, let me interject
Yeah.
there.
Okay.
Henry, I have a question for you. Steve Clemens on the Washington Note complained that Barack Obama didn't visit Brussels, which he called the new power center of Europe. Was he right? Did Obama bungle that part of his trip?
I don't think so. I disagree with Steve on this, much as I respect him. I think that Brussels is a new power centre, but it's a power centre in a way... It doesn't... On a couple of levels. First of all, it doesn't demand that you visit it in the same sense as visiting London, Germany, or France, or Britain, because there is a there, but there isn't a single sort of concentration of power. It's an incredibly amorphous, complex system. The President of the European Commission is still not the President of the European Union, and on the basis of current politics, it looks like he never is going to be that. And the second reason is I think that it would be something which would play into a whole bunch of stereotypes back in the US, which I think would have been harmful for him. I think Obama gains politically from being seen to be taken seriously by foreign leaders. I'm not sure that he gains politically from being seen to take seriously by being seen to be taken seriously, say, by the European Parliament or by the President of the European Commission. It's a whole different ballgame. So I think it would
On the other hand, the polls suggest, Robert Novak had a column today in the Washington Post noting that Obama's poll numbers have not risen, that the trip did not give him the bounce that he wanted. Now, the way I would look at it is that the trip, while it may not have boosted the numbers, did provide him with photo ops and a kind of helped legitimize him for the long haul, and it also deprived the McCain camp of another week of publicity. But how do you see it? Do you think the trip really was a plus for Obama? I
think the trip was a plus for Obama for the reasons that you've said. Some people have claimed to detect a bounce in the Gallup polls and other things. This kind of stuff to me, it's like I don't believe very often that you can measure this stuff usefully using short-term opinion polls. But as you say,
do you think Frank Rich had it right when he said that Obama has already usurped the George W. Bush presidency because Bush is an absent landlord? That at first it was, in effect, he didn't quite put it this way, but Dick Cheney ran the presidency. Dick Cheney has been sidelined, and now Obama took over the vacuum.
Well, clearly the fact that Obama did as well as he did speaks to a kind of vacuum in leadership that's been happening. Now, part of this isn't just the Frank Rich stuff, obviously. Part of this is just the fact that Bush is in the lame duck part of his administration, and there's not all that much that he's going to be able to accomplish in the next... But
usually presidents are... The one area where presidents, even as they're outgoing, are able to accomplish something is in foreign policy. Ronald Reagan, for example, signed the Missile Accord agreements with the Soviet Union. He visited Red Square and said that the Cold War was essentially over, that Lenin and Bolshevism were from another era. Bush, has scored some points with North Korea. He seems to be demonstrating some flexibility with Iran. Is it really all that dire for the Bush administration? Or have they, in fact, moved to a more pragmatic course and in so doing are unwittingly bolstering Obama's credentials to become president?
Well, part of it surely has to do with the desire to get certain stuff taken care of before another administration gets in. But I think, getting back to your earlier point, I think the fundamental political message of this, is that Obama has managed to pretty successfully take one of the main planks of John McCain's criticism away from him. And I think, obviously, the combination of that and the Maliki statements, semi-ambiguous as they may have been, Mark Ambinder had a quote from a senior McCain campaign official saying, quote, "We're fucked," unquote, and that's pretty graphic, but maybe it gets at some of the problems the McCain campaign are in at the moment.
Well, are the Republicans really in such dire straits? You wanted to discuss. There's a new article in the latest National Interest by Derek Chollet, who is a foreign policy advisor to John Edwards, and your colleague James Goldgeier, called McCain's Choice, which I have here. And they are actually predicting a civil war inside the Republican Party. And my question was that I didn't really see the two camps. It seemed to me, the camps are usually divided into neoconservatives and realists. And McCain seems, or certainly it's beyond seems, that's New York Times language. The cautionary sentence that we had this weekend from Elizabeth Buellmiller. My question would be, McCain is clearly joined forces with the neoconservatives, even as their powers diminished inside the Bush administration. And the realists, in my view, tend to be of an older generation, such as James Baker, Brent Scowcroft, Henry Kissinger. It's not clear that they actually exercise much influence in the McCain campaign. So where is this much trumpeted civil war that people keep talking about that might emerge in the GOP? I just don't see it.
Well, first of all, I don't think they actually predict that it's going to happen. They just say that if McCain wins, he's going to face some real difficulties in deciding between these two different approaches to foreign policy. One set out in this broadly, shall we say, enlightened realist tradition, this memo that went to the incoming Clinton administration, and the other, the much more famous one, which lays out some of the basic tenets of neoconservative foreign policy as it emerged as it evolved during the Bush administration.
But hasn't neoconservative foreign policy really become, in some ways, reverted to its origins? When the neocons, the first generation, Irving Kristol, Gene Kirkpatrick, were realists, and then the younger generation, headed by Robert Kagan and William Kristol, argued for a much more utopian and democracy-promoting agenda in Iraq and elsewhere, that the United States should be the world's policeman. Now, I'm starting to suspect, if you look at what Robert Kagan is writing now and other neocons, that they are moving much more towards simply unilateralism and a hawkish foreign policy, that we need to keep up the military pressure on Iran and on North Korea, the crying betrayal. They're moving very much toward the way they sound like Republicans did in the late term of Ronald Reagan's second term, when they accused him of selling out to Moscow. Now we have the neocons, who are in the McCain camp, saying that Bush is, in fact, an appeaser. That was a recent piece in the Wall Street Journal accusing him of that. So, but I don't see the neocons arguing for the democracy agenda anymore. So have the lines between the so-called realists
I don't think so.
and neocons been blurred?
I don't. Well, they've always been blurred. I mean, you saw sort of back at the height of the what you might call the neo-realist intellectual dominance in the Bush administration. You saw, for example, Krauthammer's efforts to try and argue that really realism and neo-conservatism were the same thing. And if you believe that the U.S. had effectively unlimited power and sort of was able to kick ass everywhere, then you could maybe make that argument. But I think that the sort of the fundamental question here, and this is something that I don't think the neocons have changed their colours on, is this vision of the world as basically being a fundamental fight between good and evil. And whether or not sort of democracy promotion is part of that or not, as you've observed in your own book, that's kind of a late invention. So you get sort of William Kristol, who frankly is not a foreign policy intellectual by any stretch of the imagination, going along to Kagan, and Kagan basically giving him this thing which he slots into this view of the world. But it seems to me neo-realists are all about seeing the world as a fight between good and evil, and what we're seeing now, maybe cloaked in realist language, but when we're talking about sort of the bitterness at the so-called sellout of North Korea, the sort of the hostility towards Iran, a lot of that is based in this good versus evil point of view, and maybe you think it's changed. I don't see it as having changed.
Well, it's interesting. That gets back to something that Sam Tannenhouse told me a few weeks ago, which is that the neocons have now taken over the role of the rollback wing, 1950s wing of the Republican Party. They have become the equivalent of the China lobby, and they are the most extreme exponents now inside the Republican Party on foreign policy. And it is quite astounding to me that they still seem to exercise a stranglehold is probably an unflattering word, but astonishing amount of influence in the Republican Party at places like the National Review and elsewhere, that they have still managed to keep their line. And maybe Goldgeier and Chalet are right in the end, that should the Republican Party lose the 2008 election, which I believe will be a landslide for the Democrats, both in the House, Senate, and Barack Obama. I think it will be a stunning defeat for the Republicans that they're not intellectually prepared for. Maybe then a true civil war would emerge among the GOP. But it's also the case that let's look at the Democrats. We mentioned there's a new piece by Samantha Power in the New York Review of Books called The Democrats in National Security. And Samantha focuses very closely on books by Peter Skoblich of the New Republic and Matthew Yglesias of the Atlantic. And she argues that the Democrats have a unique opportunity today to go on the offensive in foreign policy and rid themselves of the perception that there are squishes. Now, I have two questions for you. First, is Samantha and others, are they conceding too much by accepting the charge that the Democrats have been weaklings on national security since the 1970s? And that they need now to rehabilitate themselves? And second, how effective and how new is their program, which calls, Samantha talks in her article about the need for nuclear disarmament, for getting control of nuclear materials in Russia, and so forth. How much of what the intellectual class in the Democratic Party is arguing for is new? Now, Yglesias argues it doesn't need to be new, that liberals have fetishized newness. But how much of it is either new, or how much of it do you think will be persuasive to the American public?
Well, the persuasive thing is, it's very tough to say, because I think in some ways, and first of all, I have to say I've never met Samantha Power, but there aren't all that many Irish types pontificating about foreign policy in D.C., so I feel I should stick with her.
She's your brethren.
She's my brethren, exactly. We're few and far between. So a lot of it isn't new, but I think and I'm not sure how much it's going to resonate. I do think she's right in saying that this is a unique opportunity for the Democrats to try and make something stick, because we have come out of what has been an absolutely disastrous war of choice, and a war, and I think in contrast to the Vietnam War, which I guess you could sort of perhaps justify to
But
some...
Henry, is the war so disastrous after all? I mean, if you're a Republican, you could say, well, we lost a little over 4,000 troops, and we were unprepared for wars, but wars are always unexpected, and it looks like things in Iraq are improving, and now Charles Krauthammer is saying, well, the real purpose of the war now, well, we should make sure that we build some air bases in Iraq. And so in the end, it gets back to my earlier point about the neocons being realists, or perhaps not as interested in democracy promotion as promoting America's perceived power interests.
Well,
what's so bad about the Iraq War in the end? Isn't that going to be McCain's argument? That Obama's all wet?
First of all, I don't think that Krauthammer, whether he's a neocon or not, I think he's some sort of he's an exceptionally nasty I've a great dislike for him because of his intellectual style, his argument and whatever, which I find to be pretty dishonest. But I think he's some sort of a nasty form of, I don't know, national greatness realist or quasi-imperialist or whatever you would want to call it, which doesn't necessarily equate with neocons. As for the more fundamental question, I think, the Iraq War has been an enormous disaster for the U.S. because it's shown up the U.S.'s fundamental...
But
can I finish? Can I finish?
Sorry.
Yeah, it's shown up the U.S.'s fundamental inability to use its some sort of military force as a means to attain the security objectives which it said it wanted to obtain. I mean, it's pretty clear. When they went into Iraq, they wanted this to be whether you were a neocon or whatever, they wanted this to be the first step towards lancing the boil of Middle Eastern politics. Not only did they not lance the boil, but they demonstrated fundamentally their political weakness in a way where the Financial Times was reporting a few years ago that Iran basically wanted to come to the bargaining table about nuclear issues and was making what seemed to be some pretty clear good-faith promises that they would abandon their nuclear program in exchange for some sort of normalization of relations. That was partly, I think, because at that stage people perceived that there was a credible threat that the U.S. could go in and invade Iran. I don't think anybody, certainly not in the U.S. Armed Forces, thinks that's a credible threat today.
Yes. I mean, I do actually think it is. It's not a credible threat in the sense that there could have been the idea that there would have been a ground offensive before, which is clearly out of the question now, though it's not out of the question that there would be a bombing campaign.
But what would that accomplish? Maybe you're able to knock out some of the sites. Maybe you're not able to knock out some of the sites. There's that piece, was it national interest, the Richard Betts piece, the Osirak fallacy, a couple of years ago. I'm talking about the near impossibility of taking out relatively sophisticated programs like this. And the point is, you can't change the regime. The kinds of pressures that you can apply to the regime are likely to be relatively limited because this is not a Milosevic situation. This is, it seems to me that the cards that the U.S. had of its massive military superiority, I think it still is clearly massively militarily superior to anybody else, but its ability effectively to use that to achieve its stated policy goals and objectives and to use it as a credible threat against regimes it doesn't like has been, the bluff has been called.
Well, it wasn't... In a sense, it wasn't a bluff, though. We weren't bluffing. We actually did hold the cards, but they weren't as good as we thought they were. That was the problem, isn't it? That we duped ourselves, not our opponents.
Fair enough. But the point is, that we don't that it's pretty clear that the U.S. and its ability to go in there and to take over a regime and to change that regime to make one which is more palatable in some sense. It may be that it can do this. It may be that it will succeed, perhaps in the long run, in doing this at least to a limited degree in Iraq. But it's pretty clear that the costs are vastly out of proportion to what anybody believed that they would be.
But that's certainly not the argument that John McCain is making. He's of course continuing to try and depict Obama as a weakling, as a squish on foreign policy, and McCain has, at least rhetorically, appears to endorse the idea of military action against Iran. At least he said he wouldn't allow them to construct a nuclear weapon. So I suspect that were McCain to become president, he might be more radical than George W. Bush in foreign policy, that the Bush administration might, in many ways, look like a dress rehearsal for a McCain administration.
As you said in your book, the neocons, George W. Bush was not their candidate in the 2000 election. John McCain was.
That's right. And McCain viscerally has imbibed the neocon ideology. they're of course trying to turn him into a new Winston Churchill, a war hero. McCain has also written a number of books which are quite skillfully done, and is a politician. So he does fit on paper all the requirements, and he of course is very close to both William Crystal and I believe Robert Kagan, who has been writing speeches for him. And it's fascinating to me the way that McCain has veered toward the neocon course, since he was in the 1990s very much a realist and very close to the Nixon Center. And this is the divide we're talking about.
Well. Let me push it back at you for a little bit.
Sure.
You're associated. You're a senior editor at the National Interest.
That's right.
You're somebody who formerly was a neocon, but who I think would probably be more a traditional realist in many ways at the moment. What options do you and people like you have before you politically, depending on whether Obama wins, and so first of all in a world where Obama wins, and secondly in a world where McCain wins? What do you see as being your credible options, and why? And to what extent can you avoid some sort of defection in the one world or in the other world to the other side, given that the neocons still seem to be in the ascendant?
Well, personally, I see myself more as an observer. I think I don't know how much my views have changed. I was more of a liberal hawk, a neocon briefly. But what's fascinating to me is, and I suppose I have drifted more towards realist perspectives, as many either liberals or people on the right have. The Iraq War, of course, has been a sobering experience for many, though there were some people who got it right from the outset, like Barack Obama. I'm most curious about two things, as I said. One, whether the Democrats will really come up with a new foreign policy. One of the things that's a little disturbing about the Obama campaign is that many of the people do seem to be retreads from the Carter and Clinton administration. And of course he's going to reach back and get some people who've been in government before. But I don't see a real fresh wave of thinking that Obama has publicly touted. And second, as I said before, I'm astounded by the lack of dissent inside the Republican Party. That the party has essentially, but maybe this is the hierarchical nature of the GOP, that it just has pledged fealty to George W. Bush, and Bush has managed to ride it out. He has the surge, managed to tamp down violence, it appears, enough in Iraq. So that would lead me to a fundamental point that I think is being overlooked in this campaign, which is that if Iraq does start to spiral out of control again, which it very well could, then I think both Bush and McCain are in much greater jeopardy than they are now. I think Bush's legacy is that he's revived liberalism and that he's almost single-handedly responsible for the Obama candidacy, because there's such a strong desire for a generational change in the United States. But if things get worse in Iraq, and you just had bombs exploding again today, I think that McCain is making a big mistake by putting so many of his chips on Iraq. If I were John McCain, I would be pummeling Barack Obama as a traditional tax and spend liberal, that in fact he doesn't represent anything new. I would not focus on foreign policy if I were John McCain, but I would bash away at health care and his tax policies.
Well, I think you mentioned that in passing in your national interest piece, where you made it pretty clear that you did not like Barack Obama's domestic policy one little bit. But I think the problem that McCain has is, first of all, his nearly notorious lack of interest in domestic economic policy issues. Secondly, the fact that his budget proposals simply don't add up. Douglas Holt's Econ has been shall we say, under some considerable pressure regarding the vague spots in the basically a lot of dubious arithmetic, far more so even than is usually associated with presidential candidates. And secondly, I think was it the Centre for Budget Priorities did a basically went through the various things that McCain had been saying on the when he was on the road, and looked at the actual budget proposal that his campaign was purportedly coming out with, and found a $2.5 trillion gap between the two. So that, and when a McCain campaign spokesman was asked about that, he basically said, well, you can't expect that everything that he says on the road should be taken seriously. So I simply don't think that he has either the background nor the ability to. And the final thing is, you've got to square a pretty extraordinary circle here, which is that entitlements are becoming more and more expensive. People don't want to give up entitlements. The Grover Norquist crowd want tax cuts all the way. But there's only so much that you can do to reconcile increasing entitlements and the desire to decrease taxes. Somewhere along the way, something's going to give, and I think that the Bush administration has gotten away with a lot of hand waving and magic card tricks over the last few years. That's not going to last all that long, and I think that McCain would have enormous difficulty if he were really trying to run a domestic issue-based campaign, because not only is he not fitted towards it, not only does he have great difficulty in keeping up the discipline, but he simply doesn't have the fundamentals where he can reconcile these two fundamentally warring political interests that he has to contend with.
I wouldn't disagree with you. I didn't mean to imply that McCain's domestic program is any more coherent or sensible than Obama's. I just don't think that either of theirs is. I don't think you can cut middle class taxes and raise them on the wealthy as Obama wants to without harming the economy. And I don't think.
Well, that we'll have to disagree on, obviously.
Well, we can debate that all night, but I don't think. If you look at McCain's program, it's obviously going to greatly enlarge the deficit as well. But the real result, no matter who becomes president, they're going to have a Herculean task to clean up the mess left behind by Bush.
The Algain stables.
Bush Bush and the Republican Congress treated the government like a piggy bank, and the spending zoomed out of control. You had tax cuts at the same time we have this profligate war. So it gets back to my point about when you look at Germany, which is going to balance its budget in a year, and the European Central Bank is being steadfast on maintaining the value of the euro. I'm surprised, Henry, that you aren't more tempted by the prospect of the United States giving up, even pooling more of its sovereignty, as you political scientist professors like to put it, and join the European Union and dispense with the dollar. Wouldn't we be better off?
Well, the question I guess I had, and maybe this shows that I'm not fully Americanized yet, I was less thinking, would this be good for the US than would it be good for the European Union? And my answer to that was not so much. The European Union is already split between, on the one hand, shall we say, the Anglo-American economies, primarily the UK, Ireland, and continental economies, which have very different priorities, and also the Nordic groups have their priorities too. So I'm not sure that adding an enormous new economy, which will basically be close to the size of all of the other EU economies combined, to the equation.
What about Russia? Because they want to join at some point.
Not in 100 years. I think that the European Union should. I think it's pretty disgraceful that its behaviour with regard to Turkey. I can understand how Turkey is a pretty big pill for the EU to swallow in some ways, but when you look at what's happening there in terms of the battle between the generals and the moderate Islamists, it's pretty clear that the European Union's decision not to create a viable path forward and to try and indicate that Turkey should pull out has had some massive and catastrophic destabilising consequences. But I think that is probably about as much as the European Union can do at the moment. I think that the EU would have enormous difficulties, regardless of geopolitical issues, in, say, absorbing Ukraine, and I think that trying to absorb Russia at the moment would be an absolute disaster. My worry with regard to Russia is that the European Union is that Russia has been playing a pretty successful game of divide and conquer on energy politics with the European Union, and is managing, for example, to really get Germany to agree to some things which I think Germany should not be agreeing to.
Final query. Afghanistan. Barack Obama says that we need to pour more troops into the country and target al-Qaeda. Is this, in fact, a winning proposition, or is it actually a recipe for disaster? Would we become even more mired in Afghanistan the way the Soviet Union did? Would the United States, in fact, begin to resemble the Soviet Union with crushing deficits, a military that's mired in an unwinnable conflict, a leadership that is, despite its protestations, uncertain about where to proceed, massive debt failures in the United States? What's so great about the idea that the Democrats have embraced about increasing our presence in Afghanistan? Might that not be a recipe for disaster?
It may well be. That's something which let's put it this way, I'm a lot more skeptical about it than I would have been 5 or 6 years ago when before the fully fledged disaster of Iraq had to unfold. I frankly think that that of Afghanistan, and even more so Pakistan, Pakistan I think is an enormously difficult problem. I don't know what the U.S. can do to help or to hinder the forces that are developing in Pakistan. And when you look at a country which actually has access to nuclear weapons, which is a genuine, albeit minor, nuclear power, this is something which is genuinely kind of terrifying. So I guess my instinct, and this is an instinct which is not informed by very much in the way of military background or military expertise. I do the international political economy end of this stuff, not the security end of this stuff. My instinct would be to try and at least maintain the status quo and do what you can to stabilize within limits, to maintain a presence and perhaps to somewhat enhance it. But that's more because I think the catastrophes that could unfold are just so horribly awful, then because I think that we've got an enormous chance of actually being a major force of good, creating a genuine stabilizing, a genuinely stable Afghanistan. But as
let me end with a prediction,
yeah,
which is that perhaps the Democratic Party will be riven on foreign policy this fall. Andrew Bacevich has a book coming out this fall called The End of American Exceptionalism, which argues that, in essence, Americans are, I believe, I haven't seen the book, but my guess is that he's arguing that the credo that Americans, this notion of that began with manifest destiny, has suffered a body blow with the Iraq War, and that it will be much more difficult for presidential candidates to persuade the United States or its citizens that they need to intervene abroad. And it will be very interesting to see if Iraq, in fact, let's say Iraq is substantially pacified, if Afghanistan becomes the true ground of contention in the presidential race.
Well, it may, and I think there are a couple of things. First of all, it's not that the U.S. is going into Afghanistan, and I think that the U.S.'s decision to go into Afghanistan in the first place was, in my opinion, correctly popular on both sides of the partisan divide. I was strongly in favor of going into Afghanistan. I was strongly against going into Iraq. I think that there was the security questions surrounding Afghanistan were a lot more obvious and a lot more real than were the security questions surrounding Iraq. clearly Afghanistan and its support of the al-Qaeda people was a direct and manifest threat to U.S. security in a way which I think Iraq had ceased to be a considerable period of time before. But getting on to the future, I think that, first of all, I think the debate about whether to get out is somewhat different from the debate about whether to get in. I do think that there is going to be some pretty substantial constraints on the ability of any president, whether it be McCain or Obama, to get involved in new fights abroad. I think that McCain is clearly going to want to do all that he can to sort of maneuver around that. Obama maybe not so much. But I also think that the willingness of the U.S. to, I guess the only poll that I've seen taken this, it's about 2 years old. It was taken by MIT and the Boston Review, which looked at Democrats and their attitudes to foreign to foreign adventures. First of all, they clearly were against democracy promotion as a whole. I think some 70% of them said that they were against it. This is presumably a direct result of Iraq, but it became pretty clear that they were strongly in favor of going in circumstances where A, there was a clear security threat, and B, there was some degree of international legitimacy. So those numbers may have shifted over the last couple of years. Certainly I would expect any decision to go in, to engage in military action abroad to be pretty unpopular. But I do think that there is that there's perhaps a little larger of a base to work from than you or Basevich, whose book I haven't read obviously yet, seems to be suggesting.
Well, I just threw it out there, but I think we will also need the luck of the Irish, Henry, in all of this.
Well, I'm afraid I don't know whether that's communicable. I'm afraid. And seeing
well, this was fascinating, and I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, senior editor at the National Interest.
And I'm Henry Farrell, George Washington University. And I guess maybe we should mention at the end that we went through the same program in graduate school, albeit not quite at the same time.
That's true. I remember. It's sort of astounding to me the course direction that your career has taken. Not so much as a professor, as a public personality now.
Yeah, well, it's kind of surprising to me as well.
But I guess it shows that the United States still is open if we're having someone from Ireland debating the interstices of American foreign policy.
I guess so. Well, as I say, if it hadn't been for an unfortunate comment by Samantha Power, maybe we would have had somebody from Ireland not only debating, but actually setting these interstices, and perhaps she will be still. Who knows?
Well said.
And Henry Kissinger, after all, did the same trick from Germany, maintaining his accent as a shtick to some extent, I guess, a couple of decades ago, so it's not entirely impossible.
Thanks, Henry.
Okay, thank you.